Hello, it's Jack Tutor here of Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening, the podcast where I speak with musicians and sound artists about 3 albums that are important to them. My guest this time is Kenneth Kirschner, a New York-based composer whose new album 3 Cellos is out now on Greyfade. And it's the first in Greyfade's new Folio series, which combines a high-resolution download with a hardcover book, and the book goes deep into the genesis and process behind 3 Cellos, from its origins as a digital work by Kenneth a fair few years back, made using algorithmic and generative composition techniques, through its painstaking transcription by Joseph Bransifort of Greyfade, and its performance by Chris Gross on the final recording. There's so much detail in there. It's kind of a dilemma for me as an interviewer, because I was like, Kenneth's already talked about all this stuff, but he was more than happy to haul up some of my favorite moments from reading the book and talk through them. And he picked 3 great records, and you get the impression Kenneth could have talked about these albums forever, which is perfect for me. There's so many good stories in here. 3 really good picks. This was so much fun. So if you're enjoying Crucial Listening, thank you very much indeed. You can support it if you like over at Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/crucial listening. You can pay one-off or monthly, any amount you please. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so here we go. This is Kenneth Kirschner on Crucial Listening. Hello, Ken. Welcome to Crucial Listening.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you for coming on. So you're here to talk about 3 important albums. Before we get to those, I want to talk about your new record with accompanying book, 3 Cellos on Greyfade. So as we were discussing before we commenced the podcast, the book is beautiful and not comprehensive, I guess, because there's probably stuff you didn't feature, but it's a wonderful insight into the making of this record. I want to start from the beginning a little bit. So the genesis of this was a composition of yours, July 8th, 2017.
Yep.
Tell me, just let me in a little bit as to why this piece specifically became the subject of something that you wanted to pour a lot of time and agony into.
There's definitely emphasis on the agony. Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like I always think there's 2 kinds of pieces you do. There's the pieces which you plan out in advance, and you have a blueprint and diagrams and structures and sketches, and you know exactly what you're going to do. And those kinds of pieces are great. But there's also the pieces that you kind of write by accident, that you're just sitting there in the studio messing around, not intending to do anything, but just having fun, which is kind of why we're supposed to do this in the first place, I guess.
Right.
And this is one of those pieces where, there was no intention of me to compose that day. I wasn't sitting down with, ideas for my next great work. I was just playing around with synthesizers and pushing buttons. And I had this question that I wanted to answer, which I talk a lot about this in the book. And it was about reconciling some of the techniques I've been using with audio to trying to do them with MIDI to give me a little bit more compositional flexibility. And I sat there and I just started randomly sketching and playing around. Then there's this moment that's very important where you sort of have to stop yourself and say, hey, there's something happening here. This is good. Like that's a hard thing to do, because inevitably, you're always kind of messing with music and doing things, but to recognize a moment where like there's something going on here and I got to follow this thread that I've stumbled upon. That's what this piece was about for me. It was about just stumbling on this technique and creating results from it that surprised me. And the flip side of that was that it was a very rough and raw piece. It didn't ultimately sound that good. I was working with pretty crude sample libraries. I'm just messing around. I'm not editing. I'm not doing clean work. So when it was finally done, it was I wasn't happy with it. It didn't sound the way I wanted it to, but I couldn't get it out of my head. I kept thinking about it. I kept feeling like there's something new happening here, and I want to understand what I've done with this thing. And I took it to Joe Bransford, and Joe and I were working on our first record at the time. And it's one of the cases where I just say, look, can I play you this and just tell me, am I crazy? Like, what is this about? And he very patiently listened through it. And at the end, and I talk about this in the book, at the end, he just says, this is a record. And I sort of said, wow, maybe we should do this. And that was the start of the process. That was back in 2018, I think I played it for him. And what ended up happening, we were struggling with our first record at the time and trying to get that finished and out the door and getting Gray Fade started, and there was a lot happening. So this kind of sat around for a while. And the next year I ended up getting a grant, which is something that very rarely happens. If you have any money, you could actually say, wow, I could do a project like that I want to. And I thought back to this and I said, let's think about doing that record, that crazy triple cello thing. And that's how it began. And from there, the story is told in detail in the book, and I'm happy to recount some of it, or you can ask me questions or fast forward to it, however it ended up. But it was a long process, and it takes you eventually over 5 years to where you end up with this new record and the very beautiful book, which I credit our fantastic designer Jason Boer. I'm very excited to see it out there.
Yeah, you have this nice phrase where you call it more of a cookbook. I wondered if you could provide a bit of insight as to why that was the term that you wanted to.
Yeah, it's funny. Joe and I have a bit of a debate over who came up with that. I really feel like he came up with that idea. I remember we're sitting at like his dining room table and we're talking about these ideas of books, and he doesn't remember this, and he believes I came up with the cookbook thing, but I think it's not true. I remember him saying, "Oh, we're talking like we could put in this. Well, what if we were writing a book? What would we do? Like we put in this, we put in that." And I think it's always just, oh, like a cookbook, and that just kind of stuck with me. And that I just love that image, and so I really. Whoever invented it, and again, I credit Joe for it, it really was something I latched onto as I was thinking about how to approach the book and how to write it. And initially, I'll tell you, I had wanted the book to be very nonlinear, and I wanted it to be just little fragments and little recipes and little bits and pieces from the process of creating this. But as I started writing, I found that it wanted a certain linearity. It wanted to be a narrative. I didn't want it to go that way. I wanted it to be more sort of fractured. Then I felt like maybe that was less responsibility for me if I can just write a paragraph here or a paragraph there. And instead, I got to tell the whole story from like, I started in the 1980s to like, we finished it last week. It's just too much. But it wanted to be that way. As I started writing, I started trying to follow what was working and what wasn't. The book wanted to be this story from sort of start to finish of how we did this. And so I tried to keep the cookbook image, even though it became more of like a linear story as I wrote it.
And this piece as well, am I right in saying so? It's notable for the fact that you separated into separate, disparate, disconnected recordings.
Yeah, well, that was
for you.
Yeah, that was a huge thing. That's really for me why this piece became so sort of important for me and my understanding of whatever it is I'm trying to do. I throughout my work, and I talk about this in the book also, there's just the nature of the process that I use creates different segments of music. It creates this segmentary structure. You get a little bit of this output of a generative system, and then you change the parameters, and you get another output, and you get another, and you end up with these fragments. And so much of my work over the last few decades has been like sort of smushing these fragments together and trying to build a single story that makes sense with them. And I had never really broken up my pieces into movements before. And this is where, we're going to talk in a little bit about the Goldberg variations, and that was the model for it, or the inspiration. But there was something that really had this thought in my head for a while, and there had been a couple times where I'd had to break pieces up because of duration. My pieces get really ridiculously long, and I had to break them up to fit it onto something or at somebody's request. And I kind of had in my head, like, what would happen if I actually treated these as separate movements, and for me, separate recordings, which is they become these individual fragments. And this is the first time I did that. And it was really scary when I did it. And I hadn't really deliberately designed a piece that way. And it was so helpful. And I've never gone back. I go to my website. You see from that date on, July, whatever this is we're talking about, everything is not everything, but 90% of things are broken into movements like that. It's just been so helpful for me in terms of structuring these pieces and making them more tractable, both for me as a composer and for the listener, to not have to sit through a single thing that's 4 hours, which is crazy. You don't want to do that.
Although I do like that bit in the book where suddenly there's this dawning that you get from reading it where you're like, oh, sequencing. Now that's a question.
Right. Well, how do you make those choices? And that for me is part of why this is fun, is it's become a fun part of the compositional process. Is like you end up, and with a lot of pieces I write, I end up with 100 different movements in the rough, raw form, or 60 or 50. That's just a massive number. And where it's been helpful is you're thinking both simultaneously, like, what do I keep and what do I delete? Like, what's good and what's bad? But also, like, where does this sit within the narrative of the piece? Like, what sounds like an opening that draws you in? What sounds like a conclusion that's going to bring some sort of resolution, hopefully, to whatever this journey you've gone on is? And you start to feel the relationships between these different movements, these different fragments of sound, of music, of audio, whatever they are. And they kind of talk to each other, and they sort of move. And there's this whole process where I'm like moving them around on the computer screen constantly, and eventually they settle into sort of an order that makes sense. And this is one of the interesting things with the Three Cellos project, is that we changed that, and that was the first time I've ever certainly done anything like that, where the original movement of the piece has been revised for this acoustic version. Well, we cut out a bunch of movements and we rearranged a few more in terms of the order. So you have this super confusing table of contents, which of course caused chaos in production and will cause chaos in listening, which is that it goes, what does it go? It goes like track one, movement one, track one, movement two, track two, movement three, track three, movement four, track six, movement five, track four. I mean, it's crazy. Yeah. So, but that was an interesting process too. And it's about, as you say, that sort of how do you sequence, how do you build a story out of this? And I find that really interesting and fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to coming back to that when we talk about Goldberg variations, because there's definitely some kind of lines of connection that I see between the experience of listening to separate tracks on those two. But yes, we will come back to that.
Yeah, definitely.
So the cellist, Chris Gross.
Yes, Chris.
So there's a really great bit in the book where it feels like you're about to throw in the towel on the whole thing. And
Absolutely.
Then Chris gets involved and makes like what sounds like just an offhand suggestion when you're just starting to record this, and then it kind of brings it back for you.
Yeah,
so
I mean, that's the moment. That's the moment that saves the project. I mean, it was over. In my mind, it was over at that point. We were done. We'd wasted all this time, all this money. It's done. I'm getting ready to walk out the door, and Chris saves us by this very reasonable suggestion, which I, of course, had never considered, because you get set in your ways and you're imagining only one way of doing things, which has to be your way. And that's, the nature of collaboration, is that it's about hearing from other people, and sometimes they have to hit you over the head with it, and sometimes they have to say very gently, as was the case, and to tell the story properly. I had insisted, that we were going to do this piece with no vibrato, because that's the way I like it. I want things to sound a certain perfect way, and of course that causes all these problems, because if you have no vibrato, you've got to have the pitch and the intonation and the record, everything's got to be perfect. It's really hard. And vibrato stabilizes things in terms of this more atonal music, but also just gives you this wonderful expressivity. And I needed to hear from someone else, as Chris just says at this moment when I'm giving up in the studio. He says, well, why don't we, maybe we could try. And we've tried all these different things. We've tried this, we've tried that. It's all hopeless. I give up. So why don't we just try a little vibrato? I'm like, oh, fine. Whatever. I don't care. It's done. It's over. But he plays it. And I remember just Joe and I look at each other. We're just like, our eyes go wide. And we're like, oh my God, like this is it. It's fixed. The project is saved. It was a very dramatic moment. And you literally, the nice thing and this is caused by other problems that I talk about in the book of the struggles of this album, but the nice thing is like those exact moments that Chris played are on the final record. Even though we weren't intending to record that day, we were just doing a demo. It was so perfect what he played and so got at what we needed at that moment that through a whole series of circumstances, that just ended up on the album. So 3 of the tracks on the final album are almost precisely what we heard in that moment that kind of saved the record. So I think that's a really nice moment. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
People, please check it out. It's so good. And the book is great. It kind of plays into how I love to think about music, obviously, otherwise I probably wouldn't be interviewing people so much. But and also as well, the original is on your website, right, for download, and it's really fascinating.
Yeah, please don't listen to it. It sounds horrible. I don't know. I'm going to go back to it. I can tell you this. I haven't mentioned this to anyone, but this is good for your podcast. I'm on this program where I'm trying to listen to every piece I've ever, all my pieces stupidly are titled by date, which is super annoying. But I'm going through the year 2024, listening to each piece on the date it was done. So if today's March 20th, I got to listen to a piece March 20. I have a March 20 piece. It's on my list to listen to today. And this is a pragmatic thing for me to just look at the recording quality and the mastering and see like which pieces do I care about and which do I want to put the time into trying to improve them if they sound terrible.
Wow.
My point being, when I come to July of this summer, I will be thinking, I got to listen to that thing. Is there any hope for that electronic version, or should I just ignore it and give up? But maybe there's hope. Maybe I'll listen to it and be like, if I could mix it a little better, it could sound a little better somehow, or maybe it had some merit. So I'm not there yet because it's not July. Today is about March 20th. I can almost tell you the piece. It's 2007, I think, is the piece I have to listen to today, and it's not in great shape. I have some concerns about it, but anyway,
did you do the listen already?
I haven't done it yet. No, it's because I'm talking to you right now. I'm going to do that after we get up. But this was a piece not to go off on the tangent of March 20th, I think 2007. I think that's the piece. I tried to remaster it last year and I thought it was hopeless, but I want to go back and find a way to clean it up. So that's and it's an interesting question, sort of fitting in with like, what are these acoustic adaptations? What are the pros and cons? Like, one of the challenges of being an electronic composer is you're always just kind of sitting with the work that you've always had. Like, these recordings are up on my website, and there's a real responsibility of saying, like, is this any good? Like, could it be good if it sounded better? And so I spent a lot of time going back to my old recordings, trying to assess like what I think is worthwhile and what really like moved my musical life forward. And if it was important, can it be made to sound any better, to make it maybe a little more accessible for people? So that's a big, crazy program I'm doing this year. So we'll see what happens when we get to July.
Wow.
But this is an interesting tangent if we're on this subject. It's kind of interesting because Joe and I had done another acoustic adaptation of mine, a piece called, let me try to pull it out of the air, April 20, 2015. It's a piece which he arranged for piano and 2 cellos, which was our previous record on Gray Fade from the Machine Volume 1. In the course of doing that record, the acoustic version, I was just like, it's so much better. Like, there's just no comparison. The translated version is just amazing, and I'll never listen to the electronic version again. What's interesting is now with a little distance, I go back to the electronic version, and you know what? It has some merit. There's things that we didn't try to do. It's microtonal, for example. And so the microtonality in it gives you this very different emotional state, especially as you get towards the end of the piece, than the very beautiful tonal, or equal tempered stuff that we ended up with in the studio recording. So sometimes these old electronic versions, even if you make some fancy new acoustic version, there is some positive traits that don't always translate across. And maybe I will somehow be able to find that with those terrible July 8, 2017 recordings.
So that's the main driver, I'm guessing, right? Is to confront those preconceptions you have about, okay, tomorrow I'm listening to this piece and I have nothing
Yeah.
but awful memories about how that
Right.
turned
Well,
out.
and what's so interesting is like sometimes I'm just wrong. I mean, most of the time I'm wrong. Not
Yeah.
most, but a lot of the time there'll be pieces that I've just utterly dismissed that I think are pointless and terrible. And I'll listen, I'm like, this is awesome. And pieces that I think this is like this was the greatest achievement of my artistic life, and it's garbage. It's terrible. Part of this is just my moods going back and forth, clearly, or my own opinion on my work. But there have been a lot of surprises for me as I go back and try to sort of systematically listen to everything. And my feelings on these recordings really shift a lot with time. And you can sometimes I'll listen to something and say, I can see what I was trying to do, and it just didn't succeed. Or sometimes something which I've just thought was a totally minor, unimportant part of my work and my life comes to have real meaning and real substance. So it's a good process for me to reevaluate that. And it also gives you ideas for future work. And that's been very influential as well, saying like, I had this great idea back in, 1997 and I never followed up on it. How can I use that today?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Last question on this. Are you like journaling or noting? It sounds like you made some notes on the piece.
I have notes. They're not, in any publicly accessible form because they're notes to myself. But I've made a whole spreadsheet of all these recordings and different colors of like how dire their condition is.
That's so good. Wow.
the things that are, I can send you a copy of the spreadsheet so far. It's quite something. But I mean, it's like, the ones that are in bright red are like, urgent, fix this thing. And then some are just like, they're perfect the way they are. And then most are just somewhere in the middle. But it's a big project and process. And I thought about this last year. I said, I want to do this as like a goal for 2014. And it's definitely been interesting so far. Really, it's been I used to do this when I slightly tried to care about social media, which I failed at caring. I would post these daily things, and I don't think anybody was interested. It was just too much for people to follow. And I finally said, well, I don't care about social media, but this is an interesting learning process for me. So I'm going to do it as an exercise myself. But yes, there is a big spreadsheet involved. And by the time we get to December 31 of this year, it is going to be messy, but
love it. I would love to see that data.
Yeah, happy to send it to you.
Wicked. Ken, let's go to your important records now. So before we get into any of them specifically, one question I like to ask is about how you thought about the word important when picking your list of records. So was there a way that you understood important to come up with the list of records?
That's interesting. I had just kind of assumed that I was understanding it only one particular way. Those were records to me that were, I would say, personally, musically important. Like these are records that sort of changed the course of my musical life. And my own, my musical life is connected to the rest of my life. But for me, the records I picked were ones that were like critical points where, I shifted direction or shifted my understanding of what I was doing. So I think it was a personal musical, I wouldn't say it's like, I was sad that day. It's not about like totally personal life. It's about like my personal musical development. I guess that's how I interpreted it.
Nice. Cool. Yeah. Okay, let's go for your first record then. So you've gone for, firstly, Gary Numan's The Pleasure Principle.
Yes. Awesome record, right?
It's so good. So good.
So good.
Yeah, give me a little introduction as to why this one's important.
Well, there's a whole story. Each of these also has a story of how I came across them. So, the year is 1982. Dinosaurs roam the earth. And I'm 12 years old, and I have no relationship whatsoever with music. Music has no relevance in my life. I've taken piano lessons as a kid because my parents wanted me to, and I was obedient, and I would have terrible anxiety and throw up before every recital, and it was just awful. I hated classical music. I had no interest in it. I had no knowledge or awareness that there was such a thing as pop music. I completely disconnected from, I played an instrument or whatever, but it was not relevant in any way to my life, music. And one day at school, we went on a field trip. And so we're on a bus driving somewhere. And there's this kid on the bus who has this thing called a synthesizer. And I'd never heard of anything like this. Now, of course, in retrospect, 1982, this is a toy Casio, which we would laugh at nowadays. But to me, this is like alien technology from the future. I've never seen anything like this. It's so high tech. It's like the most high tech imaginable thing I'd ever seen. And I was so stunned by this. And this kid played a song called Cars on this synthesizer device. And he told me it's called Cars. Now, this is before Shazam, before the internet, all I have is a word, cars. I don't know what the radio is. I don't know what records are. I just know that somewhere in the world there's a song called Cars and this thing called a synthesizer you can play it on. I was so fixated by this. I was so struck by it. So I have an older brother who's a lot older than me, and he had been in the military and had been traveling around the world a lot. And he lived in sort of this dungeon-like lair in our basement. But he had a lot of records, and he had a record player down there. And so I said, I'm going to find this song Cars. You can't Google it. You can't look it up. I got a word is what I have. And so I go down to the base. I start sneaking down to the basement because he's out somewhere, stationed somewhere around the world. But there's all these records he's left behind. And I sneak down to the basement. I start digging through things in his room. And I decide that I'm going to go through every vinyl record that he has, just in case there's a song called Cars. And so I started doing, there's hundreds of them. I don't know what I was thinking. There's hundreds of them. So I'm going through, sneaking down into the basement in the darkness, going through, looking at every song name, every track title, in case there's a song called Cars. And then at some point, I find it. Because he had been stationed somewhere in the world, and one of his barracks mates had a copy of The Pleasure Principle by Gary Numan, and he stole it. And he brought it back to the U.S. and threw it in the basement. And my entire musical life is contingent on that random moment, that I happened to find the word Cars on this record. And I was so excited. And so he had come back from a base in Japan with this very high-tech record player. You have to explain to people nowadays what a record player is, but you would drop a needle, as it was called. And this thing had a robot arm, had little servo mechanisms. So instead of dropping the needle yourself, you would move these little buttons and move the arm over, and you push a button, the needle drops. And so I figured out how to use this record player, and I start playing the song Cars, listening to it over and over and over again. And of course, my aim with this robot arm is not perfect. So sometimes I start a little bit into the song Cars, and then sometimes I catch just a little bit of the fade out of the song before, Conversation. And I start listening, just that little fade out. I'm like, well, maybe I could listen to this song too. And again, I don't know anything about music. I feel like I don't have permission to listen to a record. I'm just hidden in the basement, in the darkness, trying to secretly do this. And I'm like, well, what if I just listen to this song that's called Conversation? And then eventually I said, what if I listen to this whole record? And I started listening to the record. And that's how it became The Pleasure Principle for me.
Wow. Oh, okay. So your impressions then back then of the whole record, what did this do for you?
I mean, that's exactly the question. I mean, as you're a depressed, alienated kid, and like this was the first, for me, real moment of, I felt like, artistic communication, of understanding of what you could do with art. This sense that listening to this depressed dystopian record, which has this unique futuristic sound. Nothing else sounds like The Pleasure Principle, and we could talk endlessly about the production values on it and the instrumentation. Nothing sounds like this record. And I just have stumbled upon this unique record, which has this alienated, unhappy, but yet weirdly compelling futuristic world. Of course, he's drawing on Philip K. Dick, and there's tons of influences within this record and within Gary Numan's work. But there was this sense for the first time, like, somebody feels the way I feel. Like, these emotions these feelings that you go through can go from person to person. Like, there's a system for communicating things. And suddenly music became, this is a very obvious fact to a normal person, I'm sure, but to me, this is this huge revelation. Like, oh my God, like, you can do something with music. Like, it can, if you do something musically and you share that with another person, that person experiences it, like, that's a very powerful thing. And suddenly these piano lessons that had been pointless, that I was forced to do, became of interest. And suddenly there was like, I wanted to get one of these crazy synthesizer things. And suddenly I was writing my own music because it seemed like it was important. And that's, to me, what The Pleasure Principle did, is it gave that sense that, like, there's something that can be done with music. And I didn't understand that before, but then I did. And it was a moment for me.
So you I think like the year after discovering it, started recording your first music? right?
Yeah, I mean, so of course, I hear it. I probably heard it in the fall of 1982, and early fall probably, because I feel like by my birthday, I had gone to my parents and said, I need a synthesizer. They're like, what are you talking about? Like, what's a synthesizer? My parents were, literature teachers. They didn't know, what I was talking about. But to their very great credit, they were always supportive of whatever weird piece of technology I was demanding at any time.
Right
They
on.
would find it and try to make it possible to get it for me. But I think, then, in 82, I got a little Casio of my own. And I got interested in playing it and writing it. I got back into piano lessons. By 83, I had a real synthesizer, a Juno 60, which, had just come out. This is just before MIDI was standardized. It was just about the last keyboard made without MIDI. And I was increasingly filling my room with all these weird pieces of gear and amps and eventually 4-track recorders and reverbs and synthesizers and drum machines, and increasingly thinking and of course the way I'm conceptualized writing is writing for a band, and that rapidly went wrong for me because my bands were terrible. I would try to write music for my band and it would just be a disaster. We were awful. I don't fully blame my bandmates, but they hold some of the responsibility as to why we were just bad. But increasingly I would say okay, so rather than fight my bandmates to play this badly, what if I just did everything myself? If I recorded all this onto tape. I started with a boom box. You can dub, 2 boom boxes together, and this was my high-tech recording technique. And then eventually I got a 4-track recorder, and it goes on and on from there. Yeah.
Give me a little insight as to what those early tracks sounded like. What were you going for?
They sound like a 13-year-old kid in 1980 trying to do Duran Duran covers, because that's what they were. I mean, I have a nice version of Hungry Like the Wolf somewhere I could dig out for you. I mean, they started out as covers, but there were little bits of writing of my own here. I feel like I have a recording going back to maybe 1983 where it's like me playing with the Juno arpeggiator and a TR-606, and it sounds like minimal techno, because if you connect the Juno arpeggiator to a TR-606, that's what you get is minimal techno. I didn't invent minimal techno. It's just that's what it sounds like. And, little pop songs, they sound like the pop music I was increasingly listening to at the time. And yeah, I mean, then it evolves over time, and it starts to be the form changes. I'm writing in different idioms and changing things. And by the time I get out of high school, it's sort of like fake Baroque music done with bad samplers. But yeah, that's what it sounds like. I have a lot of these recordings. I don't publish them for the good of the listener.
So you connected with the Pleasure Principle because you had this music that was really speaking to where you were at as a teenager.
Yeah, totally.
You have picked it now as not a teenager. So I guess whatever it was that connected initially has been enriched by other things that you were drawing from this record over time. So
I was thinking about this morning, and and thinking about this conversation, and I was thinking about I listened to a little more of the Pleasure Principle maybe last week, because I listened to it occasionally, and this was in thinking of our talk. There's so much that musically still to this day influences me. I mean, the harmonic structures, those weird little close harmonies. He gets the Vox Humana patch on the Polymoog, but starts writing all these weird close harmonies. A lot of these songs just kind of drift off instrumentally. We think about the End of Me, the End of Conversation, all of Air Lane, the viola. I mean, come on, the transition from the pizzicato viola to the arco viola in Me is amazing. But the harmonic stuff, and think about the classic Gary Numan riff. If I have my keyboard turned on, it's like a semitone down and then a weird jump. Listen to 3 cellos and tell me the number of times you hear a semitone movement and a weird jump. I mean, it's totally the whole album is that. So it's all in there, and that's what's so interesting. That's the way your influences are. They get deeply embedded. And I still see it every day.
Yeah, because another thing that I was kind of picking up on, which I really love about this record, is the kind of self-references as well within the album. There's a lot of tracks that sound just incredibly similar to each other.
Yeah, well, well, that's the vocabulary of the album, which I love.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just so ironic that I stumbled upon such an atypical album for the time. Like nothing else sounds like this record. I mean, you've got, vocals, obviously, synthesizer, which is Polymoog Vox Humana patch, and then a bunch of mini moogs through phasers and flangers. Then you've got bass and drums and viola. I mean, what else? It's crazy. And there's the particular, think about the opening bass sound on Metal. Like anytime I sit down with a Moog, that's the first thing I try to recreate. And it's just, it still sounds so amazing and so different from everything else at the time. There's a very clear sonic palette to this album that is different from everything else in Gary Numan's work. You can see how it relates to his other work, and it's different from everything else in music at the time. It's a very particular thing, and again, tremendous luck that I just happened to stumble upon it. And I wish I could recreate the sound now. I feel like somebody should make a sample library that lets you perfectly redo the pleasure principle.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you can just make your own versions of it with all those great sounds. And yeah, it's fantastic.
Do you have, so Cars was the first one. Do you have a favorite track?
That's a good, Cars, Cars definitely isn't my favorite. I feel like Cars is like the least profound. It's certainly the most popular. I like Cars. It's a great song, but it's such an iconic pop hit that, if you compare like Cars to Films next to each other, I mean, Films is awesome. Yeah. I mean, Cars is great and it's fun and people love it, but there's so much on the album, and I don't think I have a favorite. I mean, I don't know. It would depend on the mood I'm in. Maybe you're in a me mood. Maybe you're in a tax mood, There's a lot there.
Yeah. But it's great because at, 12, 13, when you're hearing this, something like Conversation is just, I can imagine, right on the brink between, okay, this has some kind of pop structure, but also, or, at least the tenets of pop, but it's structured in a very strange way.
It's amazing. It really is pushing, particularly Conversation. That's like a epic. I remember listening to that. Like, this is a long song. Like there's a lot going on formally in terms of duration. Really, there's a lot going on. It's great stuff.
Have you seen him live?
I have. So I saw Gary on his first tour when he kind of made his triumphant comeback to America. He had been like really forgotten for a while, and then I feel like is this the 90s? It must have been the 90s. His people came to really appreciate what an influence and how incredibly important he was. And he came back for a North American tour, and I saw him on that. I was in the front row with my lighter, crying. And then I said, I've done this. I've had the experience of going to see Gary. It's great. But then years later, when I was in my 40s, my brother, for my birthday, got me tickets to see him again. He was coming back around again, and I kind of said, I don't need to see Gary again. I had that experience when he first came back. I don't need to be there. And I go to the show, but I say, okay, you got me as a present, whatever. I'll go to it. Go to the show in New York, and I look around the audience, and it's all 40-something dads. That's the target market. I'm like, oh wow, all these people look like me. And Gary gets up there and he's like, I just want to say thank you to my daughter. Her birthday's today. She's 8 years. Everyone's like, woo!
They all get it.
I'm like, this is my scene now. I love it. And my God, what a great show. He was fantastic. How old was he? He must have been in his 60s. I don't know how old he is now. I have to look this up. What a performance. I was so glad I went. And, he played some old songs, some new ones I didn't know as well at the time. But tremendous performer and really, really great to see. So I was so glad my brother kind of twisted my arm into seeing him again and really appreciating that experience. I certainly could never perform like that. I can't stay awake that late. Like, let's put on a really good rock and roll show. I mean, it's very impressive.
Yeah, I saw him, I think, 2013. And he did
nice.
Cars then, but he kind of fortified it with, it's more like a metal version of it. It felt more rigid, like the original.
That's part of the interesting thing in the evolution of Gary, is like you had this interesting sort of generational give and take where a lot of the people, I was, big into the industrial cyberpunk scene in the early 90s, and all those people were super influenced by Gary. And then Gary really got into that music, and that started to influence his music. And so you have this it's great to see that sort of like transgenerational give and take. And I think that's what you're seeing in a lot of more recent Gary Numan is you see the influence of the people who he influenced, which is great.
Yeah, that's fabulous.
Yeah.
Ken, did you have anything else you wanted to mention about the pleasure principle before?
I mean, I could talk about it forever, so let's not get started. I think I got the pizzicato thing in me into the bowed viola. I just feel like I heard that last week, and it's just so overwhelming. It's so great. I could talk forever about the album, but we should probably talk about some of this other stuff.
There's nothing more than lies. Just a viewer, so cold and distant.
Ken, your next important album, you've gone for Morton Feldman, piano and string quartet.
Yes.
Give me a little intro on this.
Yeah, well, here's the intro on that one. So, now you fast forward in my life a little. The year is 1993. I'm, in my 20s, living in New York City. I've moved to New York to be a composer. And there's this guy, Morton Feldman, and I hate him. I just hate the guy. and the reason I hate him is because I've seen a picture of him. Now, I've never heard his music, but I've seen a picture of him, and I'm like, I just hate this guy. And you know what Feldman? You know these Feldman pictures of him, I think I saw a picture of him leaning over the piano with a cigarette drooping from his, he's glaring at the camera. And I saw that picture. So this is probably in the Village Voice in the 90s, which is the paper I was reading, the downtown alternative paper in New York City. And, I look at this picture of Feldman and I say, this guy is everything I hate. These passionless, analytical composers, these academic composers. Now, I had just come out of kind of breaking with academia. I had gone to college with the intention of, studying music, in college and academically. And I found it just the atmosphere in the 80s was super conservative. And it was all 12 tone serialist, this music that I didn't want to listen to and I didn't want to write. And what I affectionately refer to as music to get tenure by. And I just looked at that life and I said, I don't want to do this. I want to do something different musically. And I just was very alienated from that whole scene. And so I see this picture of Feldman and I'm like, this is that guy. He's that professor, who's writing this, serialist 12-tone, dissonant, awful music where he's banging on the keys. And so I wrote him off. Who cares about Feldman? It doesn't matter. I know. But somewhere in my mind, there is this sense that I should really actually hear his music at some point before judging him. But I hadn't done it for a long time. So 1993, it was Christmas. I went down to visit my family in New Jersey, and my stepbrother gave me a gift certificate to the Princeton Record Exchange, which is one of the great record stores of the world. And the way you bought music in those days is you would buy ideally used CDs because they were cheaper. And generally this is not like the internet where you could hear what it sounds like beforehand. You generally buy something because you heard it was good and you'd hit play and you realize it was terrible and you lost $10 or $15.
Right. Yeah.
So it was always this high stress thing. And I just 9 out of 10 CDs I bought, I hated. They were awful. But this Feldman guy who I hated was on my list. And I knew I had to just hear him at some point so I could check the box and said, he's awful. So I get this gift certificate to the record exchange and I'm sorting through piles of used CDs and I happen to see the piano and string quartet, the recording we're talking about with Aki Takahashi and Kronos Quartet. And I'm sure I knew Kronos Quartet and was like, oh yeah, Kronos Quartet. I'm like, let me get this Feldman thing out of the way. I'm like, I got free money here. I got a gift certificate. Let me just get this thing done. And, I can say I've heard it and dismissed it. So I bought the CD and I went back to my house, the house where I grew up, and I'm sitting at the kitchen table and I had a Discman, which is how you listen to music, portable music those days. I remember I was just sorting through the CDs I'd scored at the record exchange and I put in the Feldman and I hit play. I'm like, what is this? There's this moment what is this thing? And I was just stunned. But I had to catch a train back to New York because I was going back to the city. And so I was like, wait a minute, this to be continued. Let me get back to this. What was that? I get on the train. Now, you guys in Europe, you have trains that work. The thing with America, our trains don't work.
Not
I don't know
UK.
why it is that we're unable to have trains that function. And this drives me crazy because I love taking trains. I love to look out the window, listening to music, watching the scenery go by. It's my favorite thing to do. But American trains just, they can't actually like move down the tracks. It's not possible for them for whatever reason. And it drives me crazy. I get so angry. I get so frustrated. I just sit there, I tap my legs, and I am agitated. I just want the train to move forward. I get onto the train to go back to New York. I put on the Feldman, and the train breaks down because that's what the trains do. And I don't care. There's this peace, this tranquility. I could stay here forever at the side of this ditch in New Jersey, just staring at the dirt, like listening to this incredible music. Like, what is this? I don't think I got through the whole piece in that train because I think they got the train working eventually. I eventually made it back to New York, but I remember New Year's Day, 1994, I listened to the piece for the first time all the way through. And it was a profound experience. I always describe it as like a very strong drug experience, like a trip.
Wow.
It's like I wasn't actually on drugs when I first heard it, but it was like that sense you get where you're just becoming completely disconnected from reality. Like something in me just broke, and you, by the end of the piece, which of course we can talk about the structure of the piece, how it goes from this, this very mystical dissonance into the consonance of this great beauty of the ending. And you just get swept away to another dimension. And I just remember thinking, like, I'm never going to make it back. Like my brain is just snapped and I'm gone. And how often do you get that experience with music? I mean, it's quite something.
Yeah, for sure. So what happened after you snapped?
Yeah, why was it such a thing? Well, here's the thing. It's like, you lived kind of a dichotomy at the time, like the music I grew up on was very tonal. I grew up on pop music, and I grew up listening to Phil Glass and to the minimalist movement of the 70s and 80s. And Phil Glass chords are pop music chords, they're very tonal, they're very harmonic, it's very familiar and comfortable. And to me, that's what I always wanted to do, because I thought that was the only way you could do music that really connected with people, that there's this world of academic music where people write things that are horrible to listen to. I just have memories of my professors just smashing down these hideous chords. He's like, it's awful. And I never wanted to do that. And so the only music that was available to me was, the structure of tonality of pop music, of chord changes that are very familiar and comfortable, because that's how you really communicate and connect with people. And what Feldman showed me was that there is another world possible, that Feldman's vocabulary it's simultaneous. There's a whole concept of how tonal or atonal it is, but he works with very dissonant sounds. But the way he approaches them is with this hushed, mystical reverence, like just at the edge of silence, and with a lot of very careful. There's a didactic quality to Feldman where the repetition teaches you how to navigate these very complex dissonances. So he'll play a chord, and you're like, "Whoa, that's a lot." Then he'll play it again, and you're like, "Okay," and he'll play it again. You're like, I'm starting to understand, draws you in. And it's just suddenly there was a different vocabulary available that could be very traditionally beautiful as I saw it. But that was broader than the tonal system that I felt had been locked into and there was no escape from. So that was the significance, that there are other paths to beauty, I would say.
Yeah, I think in an interview you mentioned that your harmonic vocabulary was formed in the 90s by copying what you thought
that's
Feldman
from the book.
doing?
Yeah. No, that's I had this. This is how you. I always say that it's like you learn things by copying. What you're influenced by, but hopefully you're not very good at that copying, and you make mistakes, and that's how you develop your own voice. You
Right.
imitate. And your imitations fail because you're not the same or as good or different from as the person you're trying to imitate. And what ends up happening is you develop your own voice in those failures and in those ways in which you are not quite able to be exactly what you wanted to be. And that was very much. I mean, I could send you 100 pieces of mine that are just these pitiful attempts to copy Feldman, and they're awful. But you can see that the failures then start to build up and become their own, hopefully interesting quality. And that's how you become what you are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought the use of the word what you thought he was doing is interesting because have you discovered stuff about Feldman's work since that has made you reevaluate basically
Absolutely.
like how you understand
That fits in with the train thing I was just saying, because I remember this from being on a train. I was listening to Triadic Memories on another train, and the train was moving, it wasn't broken. And I remember I had up to that point, this was many, many years ago, I had this realization, but I had up to that point sort of in my brain filed Feldman under atonal. I thought there's like these crazy things that he's hitting you with, like it's atonal because it's not tonal, right? And listening to Triadic Memories, I realized that it's not that Feldman is atonal. He depends on your knowledge of tonality. Like he's playing off of your knowledge of that. So his music moves back and forth between these extreme dissonances and these very extreme consonances. And he requires you to know the tonal system and to have grown up in that and to have that burned into your head, in order to see both how he's stepping outside of it and also utilizing it expressively. And so that was a big realization for me, the sense that like, this is not atonal music. This is not all dissonant. It's about this dialogue and this motion back and forth between consonance and dissonance.
Yeah. And I guess then you mentioned a bit earlier about the structure of piano and string quartet kind of containing this trajectory.
It's funny. Yeah. This is just a random rant from me, which may not be relevant, but I remember reading some academic analysis of, it's not fair. It wasn't of that piece, but it was a different Feldman piece. I think it was maybe for John Cage. And it was trying to prove that, a Feldman piece had an ABA form. And I'm like, no, Feldman does not have an ABA. Feldman is like A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then when you get to Z, you just keep going and you go into alphanumerics and whatever. Feldman he starts in a place and there's always an underlying vocabulary there, and a set of gestures that are moving through it, but they go, and piano and string quartet is an extreme case of this in his work. You could say something like the second string quartet is a little more modular, whereas piano and string quartet really like starts in a place and travels to a very different place. And I love that about it. I love where you end up in this just lush and gorgeous, beautiful space at the end after sort of really struggling your way through some complex and difficult passages.
Have you seen his work performed live?
Many times. Yeah, I've seen a bunch of different concerts. Yeah.
This work,
I went to a performance. I feel like I saw it once. And I didn't love it as much. I've heard. I'm very committed to this particular recording. That's why I did the Kronos Quartet and Aki Takahashi performance. Performance is my favorite version of the piece, my favorite recording. I have various recordings I've heard. I've been to, I think, one of it. But this recording is my favorite. I've actually been to the entire second string quartet. I made it through the whole thing, which I'm proud to say.
Wow.
That's his famously 6-hour piece.
Oh my gosh.
And that's a whole experience going through that.
Yeah. Wow. And for people playing it, huh?
Oh, well, yeah. No, I know the guys now who play it. I'm like, how did you ever do that? It's a marathon.
You said actually this maybe in an interview where you said that this was like an epiphany for you discovering this record.
Yeah.
And that you don't believe that you'll have an epiphany like that again.
Yeah. I remember I talked about that at one point. That's a sad thought, and it's because you do go through these. I always feel like, just as birds, when they're learning bird song, go through a critical period in which they can acquire, they acquire the songs from their families, from their environment, and humans acquire language at a certain age. I feel like you go through a period of like critical acquisition in your music, and being exposed to music and the things that will formatively shape you. And the most profound of those are things you can't recreate. Like, I don't think I'm ever going to hear it. Nothing will ever change my life the way the piano and string quartet did. And that's sad, and you wish you could reset yourself and have another chance, because there's plenty of great stuff out there. It's just that I happened to be in that place at that time in my life, and when the evolution of music and what was available and what I came across. And you have those incredible moments, but they're not easily recreated beyond a certain point in your your sense of what music is gets locked in and
Yeah.
gets limited. And as a composer, you have a responsibility always to push against those limits and to question them. But our aesthetics are finite. Our sense of aesthetic,
Hmm.
and you have to accept that limitation at some level, as sad as it may be.
So your final important album, Glenn Gould, Bach's Goldberg Variations, and you specifically said the 1955, right?
Yeah, the
So,
55s, which is
so
my favorite. So, here, once again, there's a long wind-up backstory to how I encountered this recording.
great.
For me, Bach for many, many years just represented those horrible piano lessons I had as a kid and hated so much, and the memory to me, I don't know if I was literally hearing Bach at the time, but it's sitting at this conservatory near where I grew up, like waiting for my piano lesson to begin and hearing people practicing in the other rooms or people having their lessons, the sense of the music all around you. And to me, it's a memory of anxiety and of not caring about music, not being interested. And yet the music was out there and I was hearing it. And that somehow is where Bach has gotten situated in my memory. And I never really had a super close relationship with him for many years. And then I guess it was the 90s, I had this girlfriend whose dad was a big classical music person. And, he had clearly heard or read about Glenn Gould somewhere and just instinctively went out and bought all of his records, only to realize he couldn't stand the humming. Glenn Gould, Glenn Gould infamously would hum as he played, and he was not a great hummer, but there's a passion and inspiration to it, which is very moving. But he couldn't get past it. Like it just drove him nuts hearing him humming along. And so he gave me all the CDs. He's like, I just can't listen to these. Like, take them all. And so I end up with this pile of Bach, Glenn Gould piano recordings that I just have, all with me. It was the CD days because I had my Discman. And I remember I started listening to them more and more. So there was more sort of Bach getting into my life. But amongst those CDs was never the Goldberg Variations. For whatever reason, he didn't have the Goldbergs. So I had no relationship. I probably heard bits and pieces here and there, but I had no relationship to the Goldbergs. And Bach also, via, the wonderful Columbia University radio station, WKCR FM, the greatest radio station in the known universe. I listened to jazz on WKCR. But every year around Christmas and New Year's, they would do the Bach Fest, which is, like a week and a half, 10 days of continuous 24-hour-a-day Bach. Wow. And it's fantastic. I got in the habit of listening to it. I'm like, this is so good. And I've got these CDs on my Discman. I put them on. I remember listening on the subways. Like it just kind of started to percolate, in my sort of musical subconscious. I wasn't saying like I'm a big fan, but it was in there at some level. And it was in my childhood in those terrible conservatory rehearsal studios. And yeah, so it was the early 90s and there's this wonderful culture of sharing around MP3s. Like the early days in digital music, people are excited about it, and you get a record or a collection of stuff you like, and you just copy it for people, and you're handing it around. And this is how I got all my music at the time, was just friends with interesting tastes and interesting connections, just saying, "Hey, check this out," and give you a hard drive. They copy it over your computer, and you get it, and you're like, "Wow, this is amazing." So I had this friend who was a classical guitarist, and one day he handed me a copy of Glenn Gould's 55 recordings of the Goldberg Variations. And I was like, oh, cool, some more Bach. Like, I'm kind of listening to Bach a little, but I'm like, oh, yeah, I don't think I really know the Goldbergs. And at the time, I was living in the northernmost reaches of Manhattan. So, Manhattan is famously this super urban island with big buildings. But what many people don't know is at the very northernmost tip of Manhattan, there's still this tiny area of primeval forest. There's this park that still has the forest as it's been for thousands, however many years, but untouched by humans. And the upper reaches of Manhattan, I was living at literally the northernmost street you could live on in Manhattan. I was clinging onto Manhattan with my fingertips, my fingernails, as I said it at the time. But I'm by this wonderful park called Inwood Hill Park, which has this forest, like a genuine forest. And I've gotten lost in it, in it, like a real forest. In Manhattan, nobody knows this unless you live up there in these far upper reaches. Anyway, so my friend has given me the Goldberg Variations, and I put it, now of course we're in a different era, it's the 2000s, I put it on my iPod, which was the next great change in portable music. I put it onto my iPod and I go for a walk in this forest. And I'm listening for the first time, start to finish, through the Goldberg Variations, to the Glenn Gould, his first recording that was so shocking and radical in his interpretation of it, and the music itself, which is just so profound. And it's hard to say you have a favorite Bach piece, but there is a particular place in my life for the Goldberg Variations and what they mean and what they represent. And yeah, so that's my memory of it. It's just walking through that forest in this giant city, in this patch of forest that still somehow exists, listening to this music that's hundreds of years old with this very modern interpretation but that's also older than I am, and just being swept away by it. And from that point, it really, I think you hear that in my work. It even though it's this subliminal influence, the Bach, it gets in there. And it's now, I send my recent pieces to my friends, like, yeah, back with old JS, huh? Like, increasingly, very Bach-esque, a lot of the stuff I'm doing. So where to go on this record? What to say? There's a lot.
Yeah, well, one thing that I think ties in with Three Cellos that you mentioned at the top was that structurally, with the disconnected tracks, this was informative.
I feel like there's a level at which the Goldberg Variations are what gave me permission to do that. It was kind of what allowed me to. Even though the titling system I'm using is more like, Art of the Fugue or something, with like the numbers, that was kind of, for me, that sense of like, this could be a meaningful format that could do something that would help me. Because each, of course, of the Goldbergs you can listen to on their own, and they're amazing. But when you listen to the whole thing, from the first aria to the last, which are the same, like it's the same piece, the beginning and the end, but the journey that you've been on, if you listen to the whole thing all the way through, when you get to those last notes of the last aria, I talk about this in an essay I wrote at one point, it's out there somewhere. You get to those last notes of the last essay, there's something so, the final aria, there's something so profound, in the sense of conclusion and closure and it's taken you through that journey. It's just an incomparable musical moment. I love it.
Yeah. You are someone who spent a lot of time with these recordings. I haven't. I found a quote that really rang true to my experience, because I think, and this is something that I find true of Three Cellos as well, that there's a quote about Goldberg Variations where someone said that it's music which observes neither end nor beginning, music with neither real climax nor real resolution.
That sounds like my life right there. No wonder. That's not like all my work, but I'm like, my first thought is like, no, that's not true. Then I'm like, that's kind of true.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because
but Goldberg, it's true that there is a flat. I'm drawn to that flatness in some way. There's and that's the Feldman thing. Obviously, that I didn't even talk about when we were going on about piano and string quartets, but there's a radical flatness to it.
Yes.
And that's true that I hadn't really thought of it, but you could argue that there is something very flat in that sort of existential sense about the Goldberg Variations, and that's something that I do strive for in my own work to keep. And I think that's what's great about Bach is like the maintenance of interest. Like it never becomes boring, You never feel like in the Goldberg Variations, I'm hearing the same damn thing over. You are literally hearing the same damn thing. But there's so much richness to it. And clearly my Three Cellos is the most simplified possible version of what Bach is doing, but it's Three Cellos is literally just one theme. Like the whole album is just one individual theme that you're hearing over and over in different permutations in an even much more literal sense than Bach does. Bach does so much more with where he takes that underlying material of the Goldberg variations, whereas mine is very literal. It's like, here's the one melody you're going to hear, and we're going to do it over and over again in different ways. And that's the way Three Cellos works. But that, clearly these things, I'm getting this stuff from Bach, I'm getting the fugal structure. All that stuff is getting, recycled and sort of watered down what I'm doing and simplified. But that's the inspiration there.
What do you think of the humming?
It doesn't bug me. I got used to it. It's one of those things you get used to, and it doesn't bug you anymore. I actually have a sample library that like gives you an automatic Glenn Gould humming. If you
no way.
No, it's brilliant. If you can push this button and something go along with your playing. I thought that was brilliant.
That's amazing.
But yeah, no, it doesn't bug me. It's interesting, Glenn Gould, I didn't know anything about Glenn Gould for many years. When I first was starting out in New York, I worked as the secretary to a famous mad scientist. That was my day job, how I survived. And he was a big classical music person. He was a famous molecular neurobiologist. And he was a huge Glenn Gould fan. I remember the first day I met him when I came in to interview, he had just come back from visiting Glenn Gould's grave in Canada. And I was like, this is a stupid kid. I was like, who's Glenn Gould? He's like, oh. So clearly I was eventually exposed to it and came to appreciate the musicianship there.
yeah, because Glenn is a whole other thing, right?
That's a whole other thing. Like you can go on a whole thing with what with his techniques and approach and philosophy and madness and craziness and the wacky things he do, and it's just it's fascinating. I should very much say that I am by no means a Bach expert or a Glenn Gould expert. Like I come at this stuff really as a listener, as an appreciative listener, and my analytical knowledge of many of the Bach composition techniques, and in particular the Glenn Gould performance techniques, is quite limited. I just love the musicality, and that just draws me in.
Yeah. Similarly, like I have very little background on Glenn Gould, but I mean, just the little insights that I've been able to pick up. Wonderful about his life and his.
Here's an interesting one for you and for anyone listening. And this, my boss Jimmy Schwartz, the scientist I worked with, got me into this, and it's a fascinating thing. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Solitude trilogy,
no.
But Glenn Gould made this crazy series of radio documentaries for the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, and they're fascinating. They're all about. The first one is called The Idea of North, and it's about people living in the far north of Canada, people who've kind of like rejected society or living in just very strange or isolated ways. And they're like sound documentaries where he constructs them in this very contrapuntal form. They're very musical, but it's made of like interviews and field recordings. They're fascinating, and everybody should listen to them. And my old boss got me into them. Really weird project called the Solitude Trilogy. Really just a cool piece of almost sound art, proto sound art / sonic documentary. Just one of his many eccentric projects, but a very compelling one. Highly recommended.
Okay, I will definitely check that out. So another thing that caught my eye, which maybe has some tie-in as well with your approach, and I will find out, this could be tenuous, but his attitude towards live performance, like he was obviously at a certain point just stopped and was very antagonized by from what I gathered,
antagonized. That's me.
And you've had your own relationship with live performance, and taking different approaches in a way that, from what I could see, kind of instigate a reflection on the formats of live performance itself in the way
it's about manifests. It's about me not wanting to do it and coming up with some excuse or scam to do something that is not conventional. I'm not a performer, and I kind of wish I was. I wish I could get back to that, like the rock and roll days where I love to get out there and jam with my band or whatever. But to me, it's just like it's a lot of work, and I'm never happy with the results. Like even the good concerts, like Taylor Dupree and I have a live album called May, which is on
Hmm.
Room 40. And we walked off that stage like we were actively heckled during that show.
No
It was a
way.
nightmare. We walked off stage, and I said that was the worst experience I've ever had in my life. We played horribly, and Taylor wisely is like, I think that was actually pretty good. We should release that. um, and then when he forced me into the studio to listen to it and edit it and clean it, I was like, all right, fine, it's all right, it's pretty good. But my even in my best performances, if that is one of them, I walk off stage just disgruntled and angry and upset and disappointed in myself. And I'm just someone who likes the control of the studio because I like to correct my own mistakes. I like to listen carefully and hear what's wrong and understand deeply what's wrong with something and slowly improve it.
Right.
Whereas live performance is like it's about being good in the moment, and I'm just not fundamentally good. I feel as a musician, or at least I'm too hard on myself about it.
Right.
I have a lot of weird conceptual performances. I've done performances where there was one where, I was only playing the silences between notes. I like literally pressed spacebar to pause a recording. So I'm like, I announced this. Sorry, I said I'm not responsible for any of the sounds. I'm just controlling the duration of the silences between them. And I did one performance where
Wow.
I like pressed play and just walked off. And then I had one performance where my apartment had like burned down a week beforehand, and I was just such a mess. I was like, I gave the recording to a friend. I said, you press play and walk off.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
So, occasionally I will be compelled to perform either by my friends really wanting me to do it, or by having some offer of a free trip to some nice European capital with a fancy hotel. And I'm like, okay, I'll come up with some scam for airfare and hotel and nice meal. I'll do it. But I very rarely feel like this is a good expression of what I'm trying to achieve artistically. So I feel a little, a kinship with Glenn Gould there. And Glenn Gould famously, I don't know the details on this, but he was infamous for like heavily editing his own recordings in ways that I think a lot of classical people really frowned upon at the time. This sense that he was, creating a construct, an artificial construct, rather than a documentation of a live act. And of course, my entire musical life is about creating artificial constructs. That's what I
Right.
do,
Right.
So it makes sense that I'm kind of drawn to that philosophy in a way.
Yeah. I mean, I just love as well that he would do that painstaking editing to get the best
Yeah.
possible take
The best possible takes. Yeah. I mean,
and hum over it.
that's, yeah, that's a parable of my own work as well. Go crazy, perfecting everything and then just do something nonsensical.
Oh,
Ugh.
amazing. Anything else you wanted to slip in about
I
Bach,
don't know.
Glenn?
The
Or...
book, Three Cellos, other stuff. I mean, I could go on a whole riff about counterpoint because that's the other connection, of course, between between Goldberg variations of Bach in general and where I've ended up with Three Cellos is, it's just a good, concluding theme, maybe. Like counterpoint is
Yeah.
one of those things. Like as I was growing up as a rebellious kid, like, this you travel back in time and find me as a teenager and say like, haha, you're obsessed with writing counterpoint. I'd be like, no. That's like never what I wanted to become. I wanted to like, I'm interested in breaking rules and making up my own systems. But, that's kind of, I feel like why the Bach becomes so significant later in life is you find that there are these things in music and the music from the past that are valuable, even if you're going to change them in some sort of weird modern way, that there's something helpful there. And then, Three Cellos is very much about my relationship to counterpoint and finding out how do I do counterpoint as someone who doesn't like rules and doesn't want to sit through an academic class telling me the right way to do something. I want to invent my own systems and have my own way of doing it. But yet there is some sort of connection there because this basic idea of composing a piece by having independently moving melodic lines that then, when they gel together, form this emergent harmonic structure. Like that is so exciting.
Mm.
And I read all my stuff breaks all of the rules of counterpoint. Like if you were teaching counterpoint, like the professor would have a heart attack listening to what I'm doing. It's totally illegal what I'm doing. I've never mentioned the things that are just wrong and mistaken. It's a big mess. But I've slowly come to understand as I'm doing this, like there are certain rules and processes I'm following. And the idea is I try to think about it like, like with math, like you have different axiom systems, different ways of building up mathematical structures. And maybe there's other ways of doing counterpoint that could be interesting. So if you say, all right, well, your voices absolutely must not cross. Well, hey, what if your voices cross all the time? What is that that happens then? What do you get? What's the result of changing that axiom? If you're supposed to move in counterpoint by small things. What if you jump in crazy ways, which my stuff does all the time? What do you get? You get a different output. You get a different system. So I try to say like, no, I'm not writing classically. I'm not writing in these traditional ways. I'm not following the tradition that Bach was very much a part of, but there is still there's some continuity there. And that's that excitement and love of watching these systems unfold. And once you set them loose and let them run, that's what's fun. That's what I enjoy.
Ken, one more question for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've talked a lot about the Discman, which has brought me a lot of pleasure, but I would like to ask about how you bring music into your life nowadays and how you tend to listen to it. Do you have preferred formats? Where do you go to buy music? Let me into your life as a music consumer and listener.
It's an interesting breakdown. I feel like there's two main modes I have of listening. One mode involves cleaning the apartment and doing the dishes with really trashy 80s pop music.
Yeah.
That's honestly, that's probably the biggest temporal amount of music I'm spending is just online playlists of tons of 80s pop music, occasionally going into some 90s alternative or industrial, but mostly 80s pop, let's be honest. And that's what gets the dishes done, and that's what gets the apartment clean. But that's important. And the other part is like the more like it's more like the professional responsibility part of sitting there in the morning with a list of like links and composers and things that I feel I need to study or hear or think about or colleagues or this. And there's a way in which that's less fun, but also very important. And that's the little more like the thoughtful, concentrated listening, whether it's a friend's work or someone who's been recommended or some new record that you've heard is good. And generally that, in terms of the mechanics, that's also all online, which is, a little sad, in that it's just a bunch of links that I have a list and I'm going through saying, okay, today we got to get a listen to this and that. So, not always the most, I've always been, and I've kind of lost touch with this recently. I've been a mobile music person, like ever since my first Walkman, which was an actual tape Walkman. Walking around listening to music is just my favorite thing. And I've gotten out of the habit of that. It's maybe because I live in Brooklyn where it's a little quieter rather than Manhattan where it's a little crazier like I used to. But that was my favorite thing to do in New York City was just put on some Public Enemy or whatever I'm listening to and just walk around the city. My absolute fan. I still occasionally get around to that and I throw something on my phone and I'm like, this is awesome. I remember I was listening to the Sisters of Mercy. I hadn't listened to Sisters of Mercy in forever. And I was walking through the East Village listening to Sisters of Mercy at night. And I'm like, this is great. Why don't I do this more often? So that's my note to self. Listen to more goth, industrial stuff, walking around Lower Manhattan.
Bro, well, Ken, this has been amazing. I've
super
loved,
fun. Thank you.
Yeah, the insight into three cellos, the additional insights as well have been wonderful. I loved spending some time with these three records and then getting so many wonderful thoughts from you. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Super fun. Happy to do this anytime. I love chatting about this stuff.
Wicked. To everyone listening, see you next time. Goodbye.